Hi, welcome to the first session, maybe the only session actually, regarding this chapter today. This is the fourth week of International Economics 360. What we're going to do today is go over the single most important part of chapter 6, I believe, or is it chapter 5? The chapter about Hecksher Ohlin. And we're not going to deal, as the syllabus indicates, with the latter part of the chapter. So this is week number 4, and we're going to deal with the issues of Hecksher Ohlin. So in week number 5, we will do the Stolper-Samuelson, the Dutch disease, and the Leontief paradox. And then in week 6, and that will be the end of the theory, we will deal with some of the theories that came after Hecksher Ohlin, and essentially only descriptive. So for all practical purposes, with the exception of the Stolper-Samuelson that we're going to discuss next week, all what we have to do right now is see if we can acquire as good of an understanding as possible of these theories, because this will be the end of the theory per se. Since week 7 is an exam, and week 8 we will start with the policy for a couple of 2 or 3 weeks, and then 2 or 3 weeks of international finance. Okay, so let's see what we have to do for today. Remember right from the beginning, so maybe I should just jot down a couple of things on this board. You start with total government regulation. Let's assume that this stands really for mercantilism. Then we move from this to Smith, who introduced the idea of how important it is and how effective it is when you have division of labor, so that you specialize, so that you'll be able to exchange. And he indicated that in the same way that two individuals, two neighbors actually in the same society can specialize and can exchange and can benefit, the same thing is going to be true of two nations. Now, the shortcoming of Smith is that he did not deal with the issue of what will happen if one individual has an advantage in the production of all commodities, in this case in the production of only 2 commodities. The intuitive answer for a long period of time was that there shouldn't be any trade. And I wouldn't be surprised if many people up until now find it difficult to understand this notion that if a particular country or a particular region or a particular individual has an advantage over another individual, over another party in the production of everything, then intuitively they say they shouldn't trade. This is where Ricardo comes in. Ricardo took this idea of having an advantage, but it was no longer required to have absolute advantage. It was important right now, or sufficient, to have a comparative advantage. But in the same way that there was a shortcoming over here, if you still recall, which was really the fatal flaw, because this was only a zero-sum game. So if it's a zero-sum game, it cannot really be, this particular game cannot be played by everyone, whereby everybody is going to benefit. Smith showed that yes, everybody can play and everybody can benefit, provided that they have an absolute advantage. But what if they don't have an absolute advantage? That is when Ricardo comes in and says, yes, everybody can play, everybody can benefit because of the idea of comparative advantage. This is still true actually up until today. But there is something that is implicit in this, a problem, that Ricardo was not able to answer. And that issue is that why is it that, let's assume, country A is to have an advantage over country B in a particular good, in wine or in cloth. What is the rationale for having that particular advantage? The answer is not really difficult at all. Actually, most of us would be probably surprised when we find out that we consider this to be a very important development. But things, you see, do not have to be difficult in order to be valuable. Actually, more often than not, in most fields, not only in economics, you'll find out that a valuable idea is a very simple idea. It's only that for one reason or another, nobody has thought of it for a period of time, for a length of time. And this is where Hecksher and Ohlin came in. Hecksher and Ohlin are Swedish economists. And essentially, they wanted to find out, they wanted to rationalize, to be able to provide a strong understanding of why is it that country A is going to be more efficient in a particular good while country B is going to be more efficient in the production of another good. And this is really another name for this, and that's why it became known as the factor endowment theory. So notice what we are saying. We are not really replacing, as some would have you think, the theory of Ricardo. We're just adding another layer of explanation. We're saying that the trade is based on comparative advantage. But the reason for the comparative advantage, they're saying, is factor endowments. So it is factor endowment theory. What does factor endowment theory mean? It really is very simple. All what that means is that we're going to assume that particular countries are going to have different natural endowments. If we are to go back to the ideas, by the way, of both Hecksher and Ohlin, one thing that they spoke about will be Sweden and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Sweden has lots of timber. Saudi Arabia has lots of oil. These are the natural endowments. So if one country is rich in one factor, while another country is rich in another factor, they said this is therefore what explains the fact that Sweden is going to enjoy an advantage in the production of timber, while Saudi Arabia is going to enjoy an advantage in the production of oil. Now, there's nothing wrong with this theory, actually, but its implications are even more important than this, because what it's really saying, if we're going to generalize a little bit, is that every single country is going to specialize in the production of that particular product that depends on the factor in which it is abundantly endowed. So every country would enjoy an advantage in producing ABC if ABC is going to be very heavily dependent on a factor that the country is very well endowed with. Now, to me, the interesting thing about this are some of the implications once you stop thinking only in terms of natural resources. It goes without saying that when you think only of natural resources, it's very simple. If you happen to live in a particular country and there is lots of oil, then definitely that particular country is going to enjoy an advantage in the production of oil. But what about if we're going to generalize a little bit more and speak in terms of capital intensity? Let's spell it out so that you can confuse it with international trade. Capital intensity and labor intensity. This is, by the way, going to be one of the issues that we're going to discuss next week when we speak about what I've already called the Leontief paradox. So as you can see, it isn't only the natural resources. We move beyond that into thinking in terms of whether the process of production is going to be capital intensive or labor intensive. So what is this saying now? Again, it's really very common sense. It's saying that a particular society that is very well endowed with capital, that's to say a society that is wealthy, a society that has lots of capital, is going to enjoy an advantage whenever it's going to be trading with a society that does not have lots of capital. So society that is extremely well developed, very rich, very wealthy, would tend therefore to specialize in the production of technically sophisticated goods that would require lots of capital. While poorer societies, whereby they have nothing else but labor, are going to specialize in producing labor-intensive goods. In order to try and stress this a little bit, let me share with you a few figures that I copied. So this will take us a couple of minutes if you'll bear with me, but I think it will make a very important point so that you will remember it. Let's assume these are actual figures. The US, I wanted to really not have very many countries, but let's assume the US, Japan, and rest of the developed countries, rest of the developed, and then over here the developing. Maybe I shouldn't just go ahead and give you all of them because I don't want to spend that much time on it, but let me just give you four, maybe three. If you look, for example, at this, which is capital, physical capital, you'll find out that the United States has 26.2% of all the physical capital in the world. Japan has 22.2% of all the physical capital in the world. I'm sure you have already noticed where is it that we're going with this. Because here are two countries that practically have 50% of all the capital in the world. And what do they represent? 300 and 100 or 120, so say around 450 million people out of 7.2 billion. So they represent just barely 5%, 5.5% of the population of the world. But they have half of the capital in the world. To make this a little bit more obvious, you'll find out that the rest of the OECD countries, that's to say the Europeans and the Australians and New Zealand and what have you, will be 33.2%. That's to say, if you add them all together, these will be 81.8%. So around 15% of the people, of the population of the world, has above 80% of the capital in the world. While the rest of the world, 85% of the world, is going to have only 18.4% of the physical capital in the world. So who do you think is going to be exporting the capital-intensive goods? The goods that require lots of capital. Would it be a developing nation, or would it be an already developed nation that belongs to this exclusive group? Obviously, it's going to be such a nation. And not only that, by the way, what's also very obvious is that the United States and Japan have probably a greater advantage than any other country. To make this a little bit more clearer, let me just give you, for example, one more thing. The high-skilled labor. One more time, what do you find out? That the United States has 31.5% of all the high-skilled labor in the world. So a country that represents but under 5% of the world has 31.5% of all the skilled labor in the world. 1 in every 3 skilled laborers in the world is an American or is living in the United States. The Japanese, by the way, because they are a much smaller society, and believe it or not, they're not as highly skilled. So the Japanese are only 7.3%. The rest of the world, which is really, again, essentially Europe, once we exclude the United States and Japan, will be at 17.9%. So all the OECD right now, they lose a little bit of their advantage when it comes only, measured only in high skills, because they're going to add up right now. You remember over here, they added to 81.8, right now they're going to add up to only 56.7. So the rest of the world gains a little bit, but not definitely better than nothing. But the dominance, therefore, is no longer as strong. If you go, and let's just do one more only, the totally unskilled, I mean, usually there's in between the medium skills, and then there's land and what have you, but I'm not going to bother with this right now. But let me just give you the unskilled. When you look at the unskilled, you'll find out that the US has less than 1% of the unskilled labor in the world. Japan has 1.1% of the unskilled labor in the world. All of the OECD countries, the rest of the OECD countries put together, represent 4.9% of the labor in the world, while the developing countries have 93.2% of the unskilled labor in the world. So voila, I mean, this, as they say very often, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And in this case, you can really expound on this and expound on it and expound on it, because this is the Hecksher Ohlin theory. When you look at this, what do you expect? Who is it, do you think, that is going to be producing goods that are labor intensive but don't require any skills? It's not going to be a developed country. And this is really all what Hecksher is all about. Hecksher is about explaining or giving a rationale about why is it that the trade flows are what they are. Ricardo, all what he does is that he tells us that given these facts, then you will have to, if you have trade, you will benefit. Now this is going one step beyond what Ricardo did by saying that is the reason why is it that these advantages belong to one country vis-a-vis a different country. Now, one of the difficulties related to the Hecksher Ohlin is really the idea of expressing it geometrically. But in order to express it geometrically, we're going to talk about what is known as the community indifference curve. remember we spoke last time about the idea of the indifference curves for an individual. Now, if we have a society, limit ourselves to the United States, I think we are right now over 320 million people, so we know the indifference curve of each and every single one of these individuals. How do we find out what is the indifference curve for each of for the whole country? Well, if it comes, for example, to the question of only the demand curve, if you know the demand curve for every single individual, you just go ahead and add up the demand curve, and voila, you have the demand curve for the whole country for a particular good and service. We do that all the time, right? Especially major corporations. But when it comes to the issue of a communal indifference curve, it isn't really straightforward. Actually, and definitely, I mean, this isn't the place where we're going to discuss many of the details, but I don't want you to assume that it is an easy matter. It is really a very complicated issue. One way of resolving it is to assume that maybe by holding elections, and then the election, the majority will act consistently, and so whatever the majority approves, then you'll assume that that will be really more representative of that particular community. But even that really doesn't work, it has a problem. And again, I want to stress how is it that these problems can arise, and I've worked out an example, which you'll find out to be fascinating, not only for economics and for, obviously, by the way, for political science at the same time. Because elections do not always convey that idea of a communal indifference curve. Let's assume that we have a society that's made up of only 3 individuals. And let me call them, what did I call them? Joe, Jill, and Mo. And we have only 3 bundles of goods. A, B, and C. And we ask them to rank them. Rank number 1, rank number 2, and rank number 3. So these are 3 different projects. Now this individual ranks them as A, B, and C. A is 1, B is 2, C is 3. The second individual ranks them as B, C, and A. The third individual ranks them as C, A, and B. That's fine. Now, you ask the question. Let me go ahead and rate A to B. I look at these results. They voted on them. What do I find out? I find out A is preferred to B, A is preferred to B, B is preferred to A, so A wins. So A wins, right? Fine. The second one, let me do right now, B relative to C. B, B, and here it loses, so B wins. Right? And you say, okay, so what's the problem? Well, notice what's the problem. If A is preferred to B, right, and B is preferred to C, what does transitivity tell us? It tells us that therefore A must be preferred to C. Is A preferred to C? Notice this. A wins, A loses, A loses. So this tells us that C is preferred to A. So which is it? As you can see, there is a big dilemma. Now, how is this resolved? It really isn't easy. There is, in a sense, really no actual solution. Some of the proposals are to assume that you can measure everything in terms of money. If you can measure everything in terms of money, then you go ahead and you look at the dollar, because you say that the dollar that belongs to a billionaire will have the same value as the dollar that belongs to a pauper. And in that case, you will be able to sum them up and find out what is the indifference curve, the communal indifference curve. A second assumption is to assume that you're really talking about what they call a Robinson Crusoe economy. That's to say, an economy of only one person. So the indifference curve that is true of one is going to be the indifference curve for the community. A third person, which is, by the way, practiced quite often in the world, unfortunately, is to have a dictator. Because what does a dictator do? A dictator assumes that whatever he or she wants at a particular point in time is going to be really the indifference curve. It's going to be the best thing for the welfare of that particular society. Now, assuming that we're not going to worry about the details of how is it that we move from a personal indifference curve to a communal indifference curve, what does this do to our model? This is all what there is to the model. We're not going to really complicate it any further, except, as I said, to introduce a couple of small things about some of the implications. It really is not that different, but those of you who haven't seen them before, and some of them really have been drawn in the previous chapters, previous 6 and 7, the two chapters that we have skipped. Let's assume over here that you have capital and you have labor. So we referred to this last time. So what is this model rested upon? This model rests upon most of the conditions that we specified for the classical model, and we add a few others. One of the things that we're going to add is that right now we're going to be talking about two inputs. So the model right now it used to be only two countries and one input and two goods. Right now we're going to have two inputs, two countries, and two goods. Then you assume definitely perfect competition, no barriers, no externalities, and what have you. The other problem is going to be technology. We're going to assume in this case that technology is available to all countries, and we're going to assume that there is a constant return to scale. That's to say, as you double the inputs, then you are effectively doubling the output. So if you take all of these into consideration, what is it that's going to happen? Well, you're going to find out that you have one country, for example, that is going to have such a production possibility curve, while another country is going to have, say, such a production possibility curve. So this is country A, or the first country, and this is the second country. What's the difference between these two? Notice, this one is less capital intensive than this one. So obviously what we're really saying is that in this country, the capital intensive is more important. Actually, over here, I mean, say that this is computers, for example, to be a little bit clearer. So the good itself is going to be using more of a particular good than the other. So this is a country that is rich in capital, therefore it's going to be producing more computers, while this one, I don't say shoes. So far so good, because this is what the production possibility curve. What else do we need to find out the level of equilibrium for an autarky? We need the indifference curve. Which indifference curve, though? I need right now the communal indifference curve. One way of overcoming the problem for a communal indifference curve is to assume that both societies have the same tastes. So if they're going to have the same taste, they're going to have communal curves that are more or less of the same shape. So let me assume, for the sake of the argument, that this is going to be a society with such a communal indifference curve. So what's happened to this society? This society is going to be producing this much of the computers and this much of the shoes. While this society, let's assume again for the sake of the argument that it is going to be right over here. So this is going to be producing this much of the computers and this much of the shoes. What do I know about these, by the way, right now? I mean, this is, as you can see, similar to a quick also review one more time of the things that we have discussed earlier. This is what the domestic terms of trade. This over here, the rate of exchange of one to the other, right, is equal to the slope also of the indifference curve, which is really the ratio of the marginal utilities. So this is going to be the domestic terms of trade. And this over here is going to be the domestic terms of trade for this country. Go back to what we spoke about last time and the time before. When would two countries be able to trade? Whenever they have different domestic terms of trade. So if this slope is different than this slope, then they'd be able to go ahead and trade. At what terms of trade? At a term of trade that's going to be somewhere in between these two. So just for the sake of the argument, let me assume, let me see if I can use a different color. Let me assume that we're going to have right now a term of trade similar to this. So what can this country do right now to make this look a little bit different? Okay. Now this country, instead of producing and consuming at this equilibrium, will now produce at this equilibrium and say, for the sake of the argument, is going to consume right now at this equilibrium. So what happened right now to this country? It has moved from this to this. Isn't this better? Given the same resources, it can have more of this good, but maybe trading a little bit of the other, right? But the important thing is that it has moved to a higher level of indifference. That's why we know that it's better. It's better for this country because it has moved to a higher level of an indifference curve. Now the same thing is true to the other country. Now this other country might have, if you're going to take this at the same rate, so this might be maybe something such as this, and so it will move maybe to this, right? So right now it's going to produce here, but it's going to consume there, which is a higher level of indifference. So given the same resources, each of them will be able to improve its welfare. Now to make sure that you have understood this, although the diagrams are not very neat, but you can tell from right now, if I am producing here, how much of shoes am I producing? I'm producing this much shoes, right? Let me say, for the sake of the argument, that I'm consuming them up here. So I'm consuming this much shoes. So what am I doing with the extras? I'm exporting them now. So these are my exports, right? So this right now becomes my export of shoes. What do I export them for? I export them in exchange for some of the computers. I'm producing only this much computers, but I am consuming them up here, so these would be my imports. So I export this and I import that. And obviously if we're going to be talking only about two countries, and if the diagrams are drawn to scale using computer and rulers, then definitely the imports of one will have to be the export of the other. So if these are being imported by this country, then they're going to be exported by this country, and these that are exported by this country are going to be imported by this country. Right? Now, the other thing that is very obvious about this, number one, that the production possibility curve right now is increasing, shows increasing returns, increasing opportunity cost. The indifference curve, we assume that there is such a thing as a communal indifference curve, and as you can see, it will be very difficult to have an impossibility actually to have 100% specialization. So this is one of the reasons why no matter what, you find out that in the real world, we no longer specialize 100% as the Ricardo and Smith would have indicated. Now, I'm going to leave it with this, and next week that is, we're going to talk about some of the implications of this theory, in particular two models. One of them is known as the Stolper-Samuelson. The book does deal with it for a couple of pages towards the end of this chapter. I'm going to really stress that the last section of this chapter, because I'm going to deal with an extensive presentation of the Stolper-Samuelson, a little bit more than the one that is in the book, next time. And there's another very popular model that is referred to as the Dutch disease, which also follows from this. So to be able to understand some of the real world implication, and why is it that international trade is so controversial, because it is very often misunderstood, unfortunately, we have to talk about these two things, plus a third thing, which is sort of a proof, in the same way that McDougall was a study for a realistic study about international trade in the real world. There was another study to find out whether the Hecksher Ohlin theory works, and as we'll find out, that the initial findings were exactly the opposite of what the theory predicts. So let's leave it at that, and I'll see you next week, and we'll talk about the end of this chapter and the next chapter. Okay? Bye-bye.